Welcome to the Wish I'd Known Then podcast, where we focus on how authors found success, looking at strategies that have taken them to the top of the bestseller charts, as well as what they've learned from their mistakes. Because being an indie author is more than knowing the latest marketing trend. It's about being innovative and creative and learning from your mistakes.
Welcome to the Wish I'd Known Then podcast. I'm Sara Rosette.
And I'm Jami Albright. And this week on the show we have
Diane Nue.
Yes, we do. And it was a super fun episode. Kind of different than what we normally do, but super fun.
Yes. And she is a reader and a podcaster, and she and a friend podcast about Jane Austen. And so we talked to her about Jane Austen, romance and things like that. But then we also talked to her about how she connects with people and like finding your niching down again, and how you can find people and connect with people that maybe you couldn't find other ways, but you can find them through podcasting.
Right.
And it was just lots of fun. We had
We did. We had a lot of fun. What's the name of the podcast again?
Hers is called The Thing About Austen.
Yes. The Thing About Austen. Yeah. I was thinking all about Austen, but I knew that wasn't right. Yeah. The Thing About Austen.
Yeah. So, and it's really good. It's so entertaining. It's very funny. And if you are at all interested in Jane Austen, I would recommend giving it a listen.
And they have a pretty big following. So I would, if you're interested in podcasting or connecting with readers, I would say give it a listen too, because they do just such a great job with that. Yeah.
And we talked to her about branding too, because their branding is excellent. Yep. And she talked about how it's her co-host that does the images for the podcast. They have a big Instagram following. And so we talked about how your image can convey the tone of your podcast. And it's very similar to a book cover, and how a book cover has to convey the feeling of the book.
Sara and I were a bit convicted that we had maybe skipped that step. So
you may see a podcast art update soon. In fact, we may reach out to the co-host and see if she wants to help us.
Oh my gosh. Well, I don't have any updates. We're going to give you all a break this week because we're recording this back to back with last week updates, because Sara's about to leave to go to London. So when she gets back, we will hear all about it. But I hope you enjoy this episode. It was really fun.
Yeah. So here's Diane. Today, we were really happy to have Diane Nue with us today. Hi, Diane. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're so glad you're here. This is going to be fun.
Yes, I think so. I'm excited about talking to you about all things Austen and podcasting. So let me read your bio real quick. Diane Nue is an enthusiastic Janeite who first discovered Jane Austen at the age of 12. This childhood obsession persisted, eventually leading to a BA and an MA in English literature. As the co-host of the Thing About Austen podcast, she now has a delightfully nerdy outlet for sharing her Jane Austen love.
I love it.
It's true.
I just love that so much.
Sometimes you have to create a space for yourself.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, the Thing About Austen isn't your first podcast. How did you get into podcasting about books or for readers?
I think even though reading is largely a solitary activity, if you're somebody who loves books and loves to read, there's a strong likelihood that you probably love to talk about books. And, that's the social aspect of reading, at least for me. That's something I really enjoy. And I was missing that. It was several years past graduate school. I was at home with a young child, and I was looking for a bookish community. So, they say it's hard to make friends as an adult. But one way to make friends is to start a podcast.
Yeah.
At least in my case, I started this podcast that was all about discussing formative books from childhood. And because of that, I ended up joining Instagram and discovering bookstagram, which was a thing I didn't even know existed. I had zero social media up until that point. And it was just so delightful to discover this entire community of fellow book nerds. I mean, really, like a lot of book nerds. So I started making some connections there, including having some people on as guests. And through that community, I made some very close friends. So that first bookish podcast was really about me, I think, looking for community and connection, and also for where I was in my life at that point, just wanting something fun and creative to work on. So that's kind of how it came about.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's fantastic. And it's a great way to connect with people who are in your certain, whatever you love, you know, and I think that's great. So do you have any aspirations to write fiction?
Way to ask a question that sees right into my soul. I'm a little tempted to say no, but I'm a terrible liar. So yeah, it's the fairly common answer of I've always wanted to be a fiction writer. You know, I think everybody who has degrees in English will probably say that.
Sure. Yeah.
So
totally agree with that.
Ever since I was a kid, that's what I wanted to do. I think I spent a lot of time channeling that into academic writing, hence the degrees in English, and then into the type of nonfiction writing that you do in a lot of various jobs. But yeah, I have several physical files that are full of typed up things. And now I have a terrifying Google Drive folder that is, well, it was my secret folder, but now the internet knows about it. So it's not a secret anymore. And yeah, it's full of everything from pretty much completed books to some decent starts to everything in between. I don't know if I'll ever actually do anything with any of it, but they're not going anywhere. So, you know, I can always decide that, you know, I feel brave enough to try to do something with it. We'll see. But yeah, it's just like a fun thing for me right now.
I love that. That's fantastic. And podcasting can be like an all consuming thing. So I can see how it's difficult to decide when maybe to branch into something new. So that's cool though.
It's also just it's a self-confidence too. It's kind of like, oh, you write the thing, but then you have to let people read it. What?
Yes.
Yeah. That's super hard.
What a terrifying thought, you know?
It really
I
is.
think they're going to love it. And some people do, but some people don't. And
I don't think that people understand, for writers who put their writing out there, how brave that is. I look at writers who put their work out there. I'm like, that is so brave. I just think it's incredible.
Yeah. Well, thank you, because we've both done it. So
and
I'm just going to say thanks. Yeah.
It is. Very few people understand that, except people who are writers or who want to write.
Right. Yeah. It's really hard. Well, so you started the first podcast, but then you started the Thing About Austen. And what do you think the appeal of Jane Austen is for people, and why are her books still so popular after all this time?
That is such a multifaceted question. I could keep you here all day long talking about this, but
take your time.
I think there's so many ways to answer this and approach it. If you do any kind of scan of nonfiction work related to Jane Austen, particularly the titles that are taking more of the cultural analysis angle, you'll see that there are a lot of opinions and thoughts on this. It's something that people love to debate. For me, I would say, number one, her stories are so human. If you read a Jane Austen novel, you recognize those characters. You maybe have a sibling like that, or know somebody in town who's exactly like that character.
Right.
You maybe have the misfortune of having a Mrs. Elton type as a coworker, or or even worse, we're potentially set up on a date once with a Mr. Collins. And for that, I am so sorry for you. Yes. So, we know those characters. We see them in our real life. So I think that's a big part of it. I also think that so many of the themes and the conflicts in her books do still translate to our modern lives, this many years later, the tension within families, the trying to figure out your way in social situations, trying to balance competing interests, all of that. And then finally, I firmly believe that one of the reasons why Jane Austen is still so popular are the romantic elements in many of her novels, particularly something like Pride and Prejudice, which by any metric is by far her most popular and well-known work. There are a lot of people who reject the idea of Jane Austen as romance, and I think that's completely valid on a personal reader level. If that's not what you're reading the books for, that's fine. But I don't think that you can deny that for many readers, that is a large part of the appeal. That's why they're reading the books. And we can see that in the film adaptations and what they choose to focus on. So, yeah, I mean, for me personally, some of her novels work less well as a romance novel in our modern sense. And those are books that I'm primarily enjoying for other reasons, even if there is a romantic plot line. So something like Mansfield Park, for example. But if we're talking Pride and Prejudice, that's basically your novelistic template for an enemies to lovers romance. Like it's all there. Persuasion is a classic second chance romance. So I think readers love that. So even if you're someone who doesn't see her work as romance, I think you have to understand that that is part of what people are seeking out. And I don't know, if you're writing Jane Austen fanfic, it's probably heavy on the romance, right? That's what people want.
Yes. Yeah.
That's true. That's true. I love what you said about the family thing. And I think that's what I love a lot about her books is that you have this heroine. I mean, of course, you see it in Pride and Prejudice very clearly, but it's in a lot of her other books too, is that this heroine who is different from her family, yet she loves her family, but she does know her family isn't socially acceptable. And it's that balance of being loyal to her family and yet still wanting to be happy, you know, and stuff. And so I love that.
It is universally, it's a universal truth, as they would say.
as the saying goes. Yes, exactly.
I think also just Jane Austen is funny.
Yes, she's funny.
The wit, the sharp commentary. There's so many quotable lines, and that all still carries through to readers today. She is an author who had books that were easily translated into Etsy merchandise before that was a thing.
Right. Exactly. She's also somebody that I think I would like to hang out with because she's kind of snarky and I like that. I like that in people.
It's the whole, if you don't have anything nice to say,
come sit by me. I was about to say. Oh my gosh. That is a Southern saying. So.
Yeah. That is so true. I think that you've hit a lot of the points that I think of when I think of Jane Austen and on the original romance. I remember the first time I read Pride and Prejudice, and there's the scene where Elizabeth basically says, I would never marry you, even if you were the last man on earth. And I remember thinking, this is probably the first time anybody ever said that, like in a book. And now it's like something that's so common. Okay. Your podcast about Jane Austen is such a unique take on the subject. So how did you and your co-host Zan come up with the concept for the Thing About Austen?
I have been slowly working away on a Jane Austen project, and very slowly. And as part of that, there were all these little bits and pieces that didn't necessarily fit with what I'm working on, but that I wanted to find a home for. And at the same time, Zan and I have been friends for a very long time, and we would be having these nerdy chats where some of this would come up. She is a modernist by training, and Irish literature is her focus. That's what her PhD is in. But as she likes to say, her play authors are Elizabeth Gaskell and Jane Austen. So that's when she's having party times, basically. And so she's a longtime Janeite and someone I could have these conversations with. And, Jane Austen is going to come up, as she often does. So I don't know, one day I just finally said, hey, we should turn this into a podcast. And lucky for me, she agreed. And the full concept actually came together very quickly. We knew we wanted to focus on these little mentions or individual lines of text within the novels and focus on both explaining the historical significance of the object, place, whatever it is that we're talking about, and then on discussing it within the context of the novel. We did spend a couple of months thinking through structure, branding, all of that. But the podcast you listen to now is quite similar to our original idea, really. It did come together pretty naturally.
Oh, that's great.
Shout out to Zan's husband, who gave us the idea for our episode naming convention. We were like, what are we going to title these episodes? How are we going to keep it from getting too unwieldy? And he's all, why don't you just call it The Thing About blank, like whatever the topic of that episode is. And it's like, perfect. Don't have to think about it.
That's right.
It's straightforward. It's recognizable for listeners. So that's what we did.
Yeah. It's the little things in podcasting that throw you off a little bit. We'll struggle over the title of something or just little things that it's the big concept. We're like, oh yeah, let's do that. And then
it took us a while though to come up with our concept. So I think that's important. Like if you niche down, then you have readers who are very interested in your specific thing. And I think your podcast is really interesting because it's like you talk about the physical items that Jane Austen talks about. So it's very interesting for a historical perspective on things. But then it's also interesting, I would say, if you're a writer, definitely go listen to the podcast because you talk about how the things that she used reveal character. Like one of my favorite episodes recently was the one about the pug.
Oh, yeah.
It was just like you get the whole historical context, and then Jane Austen used these things to reveal character. I just thought it's just a really cool concept, and it's appealing to on multiple levels. So very cool.
Thank you. Yeah. That's the goal, right? Is to try to make some of those things come alive for readers of the novel. And it is extremely niche. It is an extremely niche podcast, not only for Jane Austen fans, but I think even within the Jane Austen community, it's fairly niche. But I don't know, there seem to be enough people who who are into that type of very specific niche nerdery. So yeah.
Say that 10 times fast.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, speaking of readers, what advice would you give authors who want to do a podcast for readers? Because I feel like for Sara and myself, we're podcasting to authors. We know what the struggles are. Because we live them. And I don't know, for some reason, I feel like that's easier than podcasting for readers because you do have so many different tastes. And, like you said, within a small niche, there's even a smaller niche. And,
right. Yeah.
So what advice would you give?
Well, I think the first piece of advice I would give, which is a little bit more general in terms of podcasting, is that the podcast you should be hosting is the one that if you weren't hosting it, you would have serious FOMO to be listening to it. You would be thinking, you're thinking, I should be doing this. I'm the one who should be hosting this podcast because it is such a time-intensive endeavor. Right. There is a comparatively low barrier to entry in terms of figuring it out and getting started. You can just do it, but to keep it up, it is a large undertaking and investment of time, particularly in our case where it's just the two of us doing everything. So you want to make sure that you have the passion there to sustain it. I think it's okay. I think it's also okay to try small, launch a limited series podcast. Maybe you say from the start, hey, there's only going to be 10 episodes of this. And then maybe you decide you want to keep doing it, but you've started out kind of with that expectation, or you do it as a series. So your listeners expect there to potentially be long breaks. You maybe do a run of episodes, then you come back for a second season, etc. And of course, with all of that, it's okay to quit if it's not working for you or serving your needs any longer. I think a lot of times people are afraid to start something because they're like, well, what if it doesn't work out? Or what if I decide I don't want to do it anymore? Well, then you just don't do it anymore.
Right.
It's fine.
Right. Yeah.
And then when you're actually doing a podcast, and particularly one for readers, the biggest piece of advice I would give is to be a good community member. Engage with other podcasts and creators in your space. Be supportive of them. Try to be generous with your time. Engage with your listeners. Respond to their emails. We get so many lovely emails from people that are like, have you thought of this topic? I would love to hear you cover this. And we always take that into consideration. Oftentimes it's something that's already on our list, which I let them know and say, hey, but I'm going to put a little check next to that so I know that there's even stronger interest beyond just the two of us wanting to do it. I just think that all of that is really important. The other thing that is something that actually I think comes out from your podcast, something that you two have both talked about a lot, is the idea that your brand is your promise to your readers. And in the case of podcasting, it is your promise to your listeners. So if they expect a certain, it's okay to sort of break format occasionally or do something kind of fun or different. But we have a very specific thing that we're doing. It does seem to be working well for us and seems to be what our listeners appreciate. And so, we try to keep that in mind. We get a lot of requests for people who want to do kind of more straightforward publicity style interviews, Yeah. And I always respond like, well, if your guest would potentially be interested in researching a topic and coming on and doing an episode that is related to our format, maybe we could think about that.
I love that. I love it.
I'm taking notes right here.
That's about that too. Yeah.
A great response. Yeah.
Because oftentimes there are people that I'm like, yeah, I would love, it's always the publicist,
Yes.
It's somebody who I'm like,
Not the author. Yeah.
We would love to talk to this person. Yeah. But we don't do publicity interviews. There are so many amazing podcasts out there for readers who do those types of podcasts. Right. And that's not what we do. Right. And so, yeah, that's just something I think just kind of, because you do feel bad, or at least I feel bad, because I'm like, oh, I would love to have you on, I want to be supportive of your project or work. But if we said yes to all those requests, that would be the entire podcast. That would be every episode, every week. We would not have time in our production calendar to do anything else, because that's just the nature of how many of those requests you get. So Zan and I just really had to take the firm line of, if it doesn't fit in with the format of our show, even if it's somebody really great, like somewhere we're like, oh, wow, we would love to talk to that person, that we just can't make it work.
Yeah. Because then you lose your focus,
Yes.
like if you have a specific thing you're podcasting about, pun there, unintentional, and you don't do that, then your listeners will think, that's, I'll skip that one. And if it happens often, then they're probably going to drift away. So.
Yeah. By and large, that's a rule that we try to stick with, and, making sure that if we are doing some of those one-off episodes, like we did a special episode on Austen and romance, where we interviewed B. Koch, who is one of the co-owners of the Ripped Bodice bookstore in Los Angeles. And that was an episode I really wanted to do. Like, I reached out to her because I love her nonfiction book that she wrote, and I love what they're doing. And I know that she's a huge Janeite. And so that was like a fun, we called it like our Valentine's Day special. Right. It was a special episode. But yeah, not getting into the habit of sort of doing those all the time.
Yeah. That makes total sense.
Very wise. Yeah.
Very good advice. So thinking about how you had a solo podcast and now you have a partner that you podcast with. So talk to us about the differences between co-hosting and being a solo podcaster. Any recommendations there?
Well, the biggest thing with solo podcasting is it's just you. You are flying solo, as it were. Yeah. So everything's on you. There's no backup because you are the backup. So in every situation, you're the one who's responsible. There's nobody to sort of troubleshoot with. So I do think that can sometimes make it harder to sustain, depending on your topic. And again, your level of sort of passion for the subject.
Right.
In having a co-host, it is also like having a coworker. So chemistry is really important. You have to really get along with this person, both on mic and behind the scenes, because there's a lot of administrative tasks that you're going to have to talk about. There's little issues that are going to come up that you need to be able to discuss without worrying that people are going to have their feelings hurt, just little minor things. Like, I need to be able to, like, we've had some sound issues that we're still not certain exactly what's going on. We joke that there's a poltergeist living in Zan's house that's like messing with her equipment, and that's something that we have been able to talk about. And she's like, yeah, like, let me try this. There's not that kind of, nobody's getting upset about it. You know what I mean? Like, we're just trying to figure it out. And yeah, so I think having that chemistry is really important. Also, I think people can tell, when people are listening to a podcast, they can tell, like, these two co-hosts are friends. They like each other. They get along. They have a sort of language between the two of them that really comes through for listeners. And I think there are several podcasts where if you listen to it long enough, you eventually get to the point where you kind of don't actually care that much about what the hosts are talking about. Again, that's funny because I just said that I think it's kind of important to sort of stick to your brand, but I sort of mean that, like, in those in-between moments, right? That a lot of what your listeners are listening for is for the two of you and, or however many hosts you have and the relationship between the two of each other. So yeah, I think just understanding that aspect of it, I don't know, you don't want to have a co-host that if you wouldn't want to work with that person or potentially share a cubicle with them, you maybe shouldn't start a podcast with them. Because that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
You don't realize how much there is to do until you start doing it. And then you're like, wow, this is, so, and then you have to talk about scheduling and all kinds of crazy things that you probably don't think of in the beginning. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Like all of that. And I think just somebody that you can have that relationship with and know that they're also going to be supportive of you when life stuff comes up. You know, we both had some things happen this year where we're like, okay, there's no episode going out this week. We just can't do it for whatever reason. And that's fine, you know?
Yeah. We're sort of the same way. We're in the same boat.
Yeah.
Poor Sara more than me. I mean, Sara has to make allowances more than me a lot of the time.
But Jami is a pro. She will do a podcast anywhere, anytime. I'm like, I have to be in my office with the door closed and Jami's like, I'll do it in the car.
I heard the one where she's in the car. I was like, this is great.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I'll do. Well, for anyone listening, I'm currently teaching swimming lessons and I'm on an hour break. So my hair is wet. I'm sitting in this bedroom doing this podcast and have to get back in the pool in about 30 minutes. So yeah, I'll do it anywhere. I'm just like, give me my headphones. That could account for some of our sound stuff too.
That could be, yeah.
Oh, well.
You do what you got to do.
That's true. Oh my gosh. Well, do you have any suggestions on specific gear or, look, great segue, specific gear or setup for potential podcasters? Because Sara and I don't. We have no.
Again, you really don't need a lot to get started. If it's something that you just want to try, you want to dip your toe in the water, just, record something, put it out there. That's totally fine.
Right.
If you do want to use an external mic, you can get a mic for, I don't know, less than $50. You can get a pretty decent mic if that's something that you want to do. If you want to just put in that a little bit of that investment. In terms of software, so we use Zencastr for our backup recordings. We both record a local recording on our computer, and that's actually what I use to edit the files. But we have Zencastr in case something, I'm a backup type of person.
Yeah.
and that's also what we use when we have a guest. That's how we're recording their audio. Then the main editing software that I use is Audacity, which there is a little bit of a learning curve to use it. So if you're familiar with something like GarageBand, that is much more user-friendly, but I like Audacity because there's just a lot of features with it. I will sometimes use Auphonic for some post-production stuff. I know that's something that you all use as well. And there's this other tool that I really love. And so I want to put it out there just in case people want to try and use it. It's called Audiate, and it's an amazing tool. It's one of the best that I've used, but not good enough to justify the price, in my opinion. It's extremely expensive. And it's one of those where it's a license, so you don't just purchase it. And, and again, this is not like a moneymaker over here. So, to kind of invest in that kind of software. I'm sure if I was editing podcasts for Spotify or something, that would be a different story. But so there is some great software out there. Some of it you do have to pay for. Some of it is free. Audacity is free. Auphonic is free up to a certain point. Zencastr is also free up to a certain point. So, those are all some of the tools that we have used. But again, it really just depends on what is important to you and what what you want your sound to sound like.
Right.
Otherwise, really, internet, computer, those are the main things that you use. Again, I'm a big Audacity fan, but that's partially because I like the style of the editing, the way that it works. I am big into the multi-track editing so that I can silence out things from one track without having to worry about the other track. That is one thing about Audiate. I was only using it for some post-production thing. I did actually try to do some actual editing in that, but they combined everything into one track. And I was like, I can't do that because sometimes Zan and I get so excited that we start talking over each other, and I need to be able to add in some extra silence so that I can separate that out.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good tip. And I think definitely start with the free stuff. And if you love it, and like if you do a limited series like you were talking about, or, decide, oh, I really enjoy this and I want to do it more. And maybe you do a Patreon or something. And then that could be one of your, hey, if we reach this goal, then I can use it to buy my equipment or something. So that's good advice.
There's so much stuff out there. There are so many blogs that are just about starting up podcasts that will have like a breakdown of here's some of the tools that you might need. Here's what's free. So this is all stuff that is really easily accessible online. The other thing that I would say that's a low tech thing, and that is something that Zan and I both need, is just a sticky note that says slow down in giant letters. And that is that's on my computer screen. Before we record every episode, it's like, take a couple breaths. Okay. Slow down. Right. And that was something that I listen back sometimes to some of our earlier episodes, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, we sound like over caffeinated squirrels. We're just like so excited.
You're so excited to be talking.
We're talking so fast. And what is funny is that if you know us in real life, you would know that even those early episodes, that's still dialed back from how the two of us sound when we're just on the phone with each other. We talk so fast. It is a Gilmore Girls episode, it is that kind of a situation. And so we've become, and I think also, you're kind of nervous those first few episodes.
Yeah. We were definitely nervous.
Yeah. So the longer we've gone on, the more that we're kind of like, okay, slow down. We got some of just the kindest emails from some listeners who were like, hey, I'm not sure. Is there like a technical glitch? Like, did you maybe like
you record on times 2 speed?
Yeah. And I'm like, nope, that's just us. Thank you for letting me know. I really appreciate the feedback.
Keep an eye on that.
I really do appreciate that. I mean, especially when people are so kind about it. And then I'm like, hey, depending on what podcast app you're using, you can try turning us down to like 0.75 if that works better for you.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, in the beginning we were super nervous, and I was nervous that people were going to realize that I was, just an idiot and didn't know anything. And so 2 years in, either I've fooled everybody or they know and they don't care. So,
or you're not an idiot.
Well, or I'm not an idiot.
I think that's probably more likely the case.
I was just so nervous to say anything because I was like, what if I say something stupid? What if I say something that people will go, no, that's not. Everybody else says do it this way. And so,
And that is something we are very cognizant of. Yeah. We double, triple check all of our quotations, all of our references, everything, because the Jane Austen community, if you get something wrong,
will get you.
They will let you know.
Yes. Yes.
If you misquote something, you will hear from them.
Yes.
You do. Exactly. We also want to talk to you about branding. So you have the podcast has terrific branding. So can you tell us how that came about? And if you haven't seen it, I'd encourage people to go to your Instagram account and check it out.
Yeah. So we spent quite a bit of time before we launched the podcast. Again, the concept for the podcast came together very quickly. And then we spent 2 or 3 months just kind of figuring out, okay, what do we want the logo to look like? What sort of color scheme do we want to use for the Instagram, all of that. And Zan actually has a visual design background. Like that's something she kind of would do on the side when we were in graduate school. So she is a design wizard. Okay. That is not the way my brain works at all. So she was kind of like, okay, here's kind of the concept that I have. Here's what I'm thinking of. And she was sending me some sort of, I don't know,
kind of mock-ups or something.
Yeah. Well, like a Pinterest board, except for it was in a Google Doc, it was like, here's a collage of some images that I'm sort of thinking of for inspiration. And then here are some potential color palettes. So she kind of gave me a couple options, and because she was like, I'm good with any of this. Like, what do you think? And kind of went back and forth on it, again, with the bulk of the kind of actual creative work coming from her, because that is just not my skill set at all.
Right.
So that's how that came together in terms of on the logistic side. I think in terms of what we were going for, the podcast is a little bit cheeky, like we are providing this historical context and we're trying to get all of our information accurate. But the whole point of the podcast is trying to bring a lot of the stuff that's maybe mostly been accessible to academics or some of this work that a lot of people maybe haven't seen before, and making it more digestible for a general audience. So, the tone is a little bit, we're trying to be a little bit fun. Yeah, we're trying to be a little bit fun with things. So, the neon colors, all of that kind of played into that. So, that's kind of was the idea behind the aesthetic and how that all came together.
Yeah, it really does. It conveys that it's not going to be stuffy. And I'm like you, I don't have those design skills. And it just goes to show that if you have that, someone to help you with that, or you hire somebody to do that, you can convey what the tone through the images, kind of like book covers. It's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's so great. And if I'm not going to read a commentary, I'm not. So even if I really love the subject, I'm not going to read a commentary. So having someone break it down for me so it's digestible in an entertaining way would be awesome. Yeah. So, I love that y'all do that. You and your co-host are active on social media. Do you have a process for creating social media content and sharing it? I'm sure our listeners want to know that.
So we usually talk about it after we have maybe finished recording an upcoming episode. After that, we'll sort of discuss the episode that's currently out and, what are the images that we might need for this episode. Sometimes Zan has an idea and runs with it. Sometimes I have an idea and I say, hey, could you make this happen? Sometimes, and she always does. It's like magic. I will give her some of just the most bananas ideas. I'm like, this is a little high concept, but what do you think about this? She's kind of like, yeah, okay. And then she makes it happen.
Oh my gosh.
And then sometimes both of us are kind of like, yeah, what are potential images for this subject that maybe isn't, it's hard to, there's some episodes where it's harder to think of compelling images to go along with it. And so we'll spend a little bit of time kind of brainstorming that. But again, she's the one doing the design work, figuring out the color palette and how things should work. She puts all of the designs in this tool called Plan, PLANN. So that's what we use for organizing ourselves. She puts the images in there and she'll let me know. And then I write the captions and any of the kind of wordy content that needs to go along with it and post that to Instagram. So the way that we've kind of split up who runs what, she runs the Twitter. I don't even get on there. I don't even know what the password is. It's just, that's her thing. She was already on Twitter because academic Twitter is very much like there's a large community on there. So she did that. I was already on Instagram with my own bookstagram. And so I already had a large community there. So I took charge of the Instagram. So that's how we kind of divide that up. Other than the images themselves, which we do talk about, in terms of the rest of it, like we don't have kind of like a content schedule or anything like that, like I'm not telling her, hey, you need to tweet this, or you need to make sure you retweet that. She's not telling me what I should be posting to stories or anything like that. We kind of have charge of our own domains.
Yeah, that's very wise too, because that cuts down on conflict. So
yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah. Well, this has been just great. Just getting
so fun. Yeah.
Delving into this a little bit. Yeah. So
I have loved it very much.
Yeah. So where can people find out more about you and the Thing About Austen?
You can find us on our website, which is thethingaboutausten.com altogether. And if you want to see this the full grid of Instagram images, you can go to The Thing About Austen altogether, also on Instagram. And our Twitter is Austen_things, because The Thing About Austen was too long for Twitter's handle rules. So that's what we had to do there. And if for whatever reason you want to connect with me personally, you can find my bookstagram, Shaped by Stories Diane, altogether.
All right. Well, that is fantastic. I'll have all the links in the show notes, and those will be at wishidknownthenpodcast.com. And thanks to Alexa Larberg for editing and producing the podcast, and to Adriel Wiggins for doing all the admin. We'll see everybody next week. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Wish I'd Known Then podcast. We hope this episode inspired you, empowered you, and made you laugh a little bit too. If you loved it, tell your friends about it. And if you feel so inclined, leave us a review. We look forward to being with you again next week.